All right, so quick review of the Commerce Clause. Commerce Clause is interesting because commerce can include anything related to money, really. Money, trade, and mostly the exchange of goods. Not really money, but the exchange of goods. But I liked this little cartoon. I think the kids in this image sort of represent the states, and Dad represents the federal government. And Dad's saying he controls my allowance because of something called the Commerce Clause. So any transaction between Dad and the kids is regulated by the federal government, right? So anything that any transaction that happens between the states is controlled by Dad. So it's kind of a cute sort of imagining of the relationship between the states and federal government. This is more of a fiscal federalism image than a Commerce Clause image, but we'll go with it. So we're mostly going to take a look at how the Supreme Court interprets Congress's power to control interstate commerce, right? Interstate meaning that any good or transaction from state to state can be controlled by Congress, the federal government. This is how the court, as of today, interprets Congress's commerce power, that it controls any channels of interstate commerce, including highways, waterways, and air traffic. So the interstate, right? The interstate highways are any highway systems that go between states. Those are controlled and funded by the federal government. The highway system was actually implemented by Eisenhower. It was posed to him that we had no way from getting to from one side of the country to the next, and we should have a system in place for that. So he created the interstate highway system. Also, air traffic is controlled by the Department of Homeland Security. The TSA regulates anyone going in and out of airports. Congress can also regulate people and machines that carry out commerce. So any employees or machinery to carry out an act of commerce or manufacturing can be regulated by Congress. Congress can regulate things moving in interstate commerce. So any vehicle that controls or carries out a commercial transaction. And Congress can regulate commercial activities that have a substantial effect on interstate commerce. So if there is, the marijuana is the big example of this, that if marijuana is sold in one state and can potentially find its way into another state, can that be controlled by Congress? The short answer is yes. And that's this Gonzalez versus Raich case that we're going to look at. We're also going to look at U.S. v. Lopez and the National Federation of Independent Businesses versus Sebelius about Obamacare and whether or not Congress has control over not participating in a healthcare system. So let's take a look at how the Supreme Court has controlled Congress's power. So the question here is basically, can Congress make a law that bans guns from school zones? Seems like a pretty good law, right? We don't want guns near schools. We just don't want that. But is it something Congress can control or legislate under the Commerce Clause? So the question is, does it exceed Congress's power? Sorry, let me read that again. Is the 1990 Gun-Free School Zones Act forbidding individuals from knowingly carrying a gun in the school zone unconstitutional because it exceeds the power of Congress to legislate under the Commerce Clause? Yes, it exceeds the power of Congress. It is not an economic activity. Sorry, I read that wrong at first. But yes, it does exceed the power of Congress. Congress should not be making a gun-free school zones act law because it's not economic activity. Carrying a gun in a school is not an economic activity that would have a substantial effect on interstate commerce. So this guy Lopez carrying a gun at school is not going to affect someone else in another state carrying a gun in school. It's just not an economic activity. It's a social activity, but not an economic one. So the same idea applies in Gonzalez v. Raich. Does the Controlled Substances Act, which bans the production and sale and partaking of marijuana, exceed Congress's power under the Commerce Clause as it applies to the intrastate cultivation and possession of marijuana for medical use? So this was actually about medical marijuana. We know today that recreationally it is being sold in California and other states. But at the time that this was argued, the court asked itself, does this act exceed Congress's power? Can Congress regulate marijuana? Or does it exceed Congress's power to regulate marijuana? And the court said no. This does not exceed Congress's power, and Congress can, in fact, regulate marijuana. That because the growth, distribution, sale, and recreational activity of marijuana in California can substantially affect the use of it in other states. That it is a commercial activity which Congress has the power to regulate. Local use affected supply and demand in the national marijuana market, making regulation of interstate use essential to regulating the drug's national market. So technically, the legalization of marijuana on a state level in places like California and Colorado is technically illegal under federal law. It's just up to Congress and the president to shut it down with the bureaucracy. Okay, the next one's a little bit more complicated, so I'm going to give you kind of a breakdown of the Affordable Care Act and how it worked. So basically, Obama and Congress in 2010 had the idea that, well, the uninsured are costing health insurance companies and hospitals a lot of money because if they can't pay, then the premiums and the cost of health insurance for those that do pay goes up. So Obama had this idea that, well, everybody should pay into a healthcare system, but we should make it affordable and it should be based on how much you make. If you don't have access to healthcare, you can't afford healthcare, we should have an affordable system. But it was kind of on a graduated plan that the more you make, the more you should be able to pay if your work is not paying for it. So his argument for it is that Congress is regulating existing commerce, that healthcare is an economic activity that is already happening, and people's participation in the healthcare market should be regulated by commerce because the effects are already existing. The effects I just showed you, right? That you could get hit by a bus, and if you're not insured, it's going to cost the system a lot more money. Okay, so his plan basically said this, that everybody should buy into the market so that the market is more competitive and therefore cheaper. Seems like a good idea, right? That everybody should just have healthcare and buy into healthcare and therefore it'll be cheaper. Problem is that people don't want to buy it. And so the second option that he proposed is that basically if you don't get health insurance, then you're going to have to pay an individual mandate. It's like a penalty or a tax, but he would not call it a tax. It was not a tax. It was a mandate. It's a requirement that if you're not going to buy healthcare, then hey, you're going to have to pay into the system somehow.
You were against the individual.
Refused to call it a tax.
During the campaign. Under this mandate, the government is forcing people to spend money, fining you if you don't. How is that not a tax?
Well, hold on a second, Georgia. Here's what's happening. You and I are both paying $900 on average, our families. in higher premiums because of uncompensated care. Now, what I've said is that if you can't afford health insurance, you certainly shouldn't be punished for that. That's just piling on. If, on the other hand, we're given tax credits, we've set up an exchange, you are now part of a big pool, we've driven down the costs, we've done everything we can, and you actually can afford health insurance, but you just decided, you know what, I want to take my chances. And then you get hit by a bus, and you and I have to pay for the emergency room care.
That may be, but it's still a tax increase.
That's not true, George. For us to say that you've got to take a responsibility to get health insurance is absolutely not a tax increase. What it's saying is that we're not going to have other people carrying your burdens for you, any more than the fact that right now everybody in America just about has to get auto insurance. Nobody considers that a tax increase. People say to themselves, that is a fair way to make sure that if you hit my car, that I'm not covering all the costs.
But it may be fair. It may be good public policy.
No, but George, you can't just make up that language and decide that that's called a tax increase.
Right.
Any more?
I'm going to stop that for now. You guys can check it out if you want to. But he's just basically saying, hey, it's a regulation. It's under the Commerce Clause that, like, if people aren't going to participate, we should be able to make them participate so that this system is cheaper for everybody. Problem is that a lot of healthy young people and healthy, like maybe slightly older people don't need insurance as much and they didn't feel like they wanted to pay into that system. And it became a problem. So the question that came to the court was, does Congress have the power under the Commerce Clause or the Taxing and Spending Clause to require most Americans to purchase health insurance? So, yes, they do have the power to pass a tax. So, yes, Congress can force people to participate in a system, or if they don't participate in the system, then they can be taxed. That's absolutely okay. But it's a tax for the purposes of the Constitution's Taxing and Spending Clause, but it is not a valid exercise of Congress's power to regulate commerce, that you can't just force people to participate in commerce. It would be like every time you enter a store, you're forced to buy something. So the argument made by this Supreme Court was that the Commerce Clause allows Congress to regulate existing commercial activity, but cannot compel people to participate in commerce. Like I just said, you can't force people to buy into something, but they can tax. So that's hopefully a little bit clearer. If not, we can also talk about it individually, but in the next video, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this idea of fiscal federalism, how the United States uses money to control the states, and sort of the history of federalism in the United States, how the relationship between states and federal government has changed. Thank you.